Hello, photographers. You use focus points to tell the camera where to focus in the scene, and your focus points work in conjunction with your focus mode to help you achieve fast and accurate focus on a subject. Every camera has a number of different focus points, and the first thing you need to know about them is that they're not all the same. To understand how your focus points are different, you first need to understand a bit about how autofocus works. Cameras have two main methods of focusing called contrast detect and phase detect autofocus, and both methods use contrast to measure and achieve focus. The difference in focus points has to do with how well the different points can detect contrast. Though they detect and measure it differently, contrast and phase detect autofocus work by sampling the contrast at the point of focus and adjusting the focus of the lens until it finds the position that gives it maximum contrast. It's the focus points that allow the camera to sample and measure the contrast, and there are two different types of focus points called single and cross type. Single type focus points are only able to detect contrast in one direction, either horizontally or vertically. Because they can only detect contrast in one direction, single type focus points are generally slower and less accurate than cross type points. Cross type focus points can detect contrast in both directions. This ability gives cross type points more data to work with, making them faster and more accurate. So when it comes to focus points, the type is just as important as the quantity, and generally speaking, the more cross-type focus points, the faster and more accurate your autofocus will be. Once you've determined the type of focus points you have, you now need to determine how sensitive they are. There are two types of sensitivity for focus points, and though they are two different types of sensitivity, at the heart of both of them is how much light the camera has to work with when trying to focus. The first type of sensitivity is low light sensitivity, and it's given as an exposure value rating. For example, the Canon 60D has a low light autofocus sensitivity rating of -0.5 EV. Now, the problem I have with this rating is that it's rather opaque. Saying that the 60D is focus sensitive down to -0.5 is essentially saying this camera can focus in light that's 1/2 stop darker than 0 EV. They tell us it's -0.5 EV, but they don't tell us what 0 EV is. So by itself, this is not incredibly helpful as a rating. What we can infer from just the rating itself is that this camera is not the greatest at focusing in low light, but the rating becomes more helpful when comparing different cameras. For example, the 60D's low light sensitivity is -0.5 EV, but the Canon 6D has a low light sensitivity of -3 EV. We still don't know what 0 EV is, but based on that rating, we know the 6D can focus in lower light than the 60D can. So in a nutshell, the lower the low light focus sensitivity rating, the better the camera will focus in low light. Now, the other sensitivity is the minimum aperture sensitivity. This indicates the smallest sized aperture that will still allow the autofocus points to function and detect contrast. For example, all Canon EOS bodies have a minimum aperture sensitivity of f5.6. Now, before you start thinking you can't shoot with aperture smaller than f5.6, that's not what this is about. When you're preparing to take a photo and you're doing things like looking through the viewfinder, setting your settings, and most importantly, getting a focus lock, when you're doing these things, the aperture on the lens is wide open. You might have your aperture set to f16 for the photo that you're planning to take, but while you're prepping to take the photo, the lens is open to that largest aperture possible. When you actually press the shutter button to take the photo, right before the shutter opens, the aperture closes down to your selected aperture and stays closed for the duration of the photo, opening back up to the maximum after the photo is done. All that light coming through the aperture, when it's fully open, is what helps the camera focus on the scene. So what this rating tells you is that if the maximum aperture available on the lens is f5.6 or larger, then the autofocus points will receive enough light to detect contrast, which allows your focus system to work. And if you look at all EF and EFS lenses made by Canon, you'll notice that all of them have a maximum aperture of at least f5.6, even at the most telephoto end of the zoom. This ensures that all Canon-made lenses will function and autofocus properly on all Canon cameras. But not all lenses made for Canon cameras have a maximum aperture of at least 5.6. One example is the 150 to 600 millimeter lenses made by Tamron and Sigma. Both Tamron and Sigma make the lens available for Canon cameras, but the lenses have a maximum aperture range of f5 to 6.3. What this means is that at some point along the zoom range of these lenses, the maximum available aperture will be f6.3, which is smaller than f5.6. That 6.3 aperture doesn't mean the camera will stop focusing, but it does mean that it may start focusing slower and with less accuracy than it normally would. The truth is, for most cameras and lenses, this isn't something you need to worry too much about because the other manufacturers do the same thing that Canon does, which is to make sure all of their lenses will focus with all of their cameras. And I can't say this with 100% certainty because this is not a specification that's listed commonly, but it seems like the standard is f5.6. So for the most part, you don't need to worry about the aperture focus sensitivity as much as you want to worry about the low light sensitivity. But there are two specific cases where this information is absolutely necessary. First is when using teleconverters. If you put a 2x teleconverter on a 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens, that lens becomes a 140 to 400 millimeter f5.6 lens. And with a maximum aperture of f5.6, the camera will still be able to focus. But if you put that 2x teleconverter on that 150 to 600 millimeter f5 to 6.3 lens, it would turn into a 300 to 1200 millimeter f10 to 13 lens, and it wouldn't focus at all. So knowing your camera's minimum aperture focus sensitivity helps you figure out what lenses or what teleconverter and lens combinations you can use on your camera and still get autofocus. The second reason this information is useful is because the aperture focus sensitivity of the focus points on your camera can vary. For example, the 60D has those 9 focus points with a low light sensitivity of negative 0.5 EV and an aperture sensitivity of f5.6. But if you're using a lens with an f2.8 or larger aperture, the center focus point becomes twice as sensitive, and the low light sensitivity of the center focus point becomes negative 1 EV. This means if you're using a lens like the 17 to 50 millimeter f2.8 or a 50 millimeter f1.8, the 60D will be able to focus in lower light than it normally would if you were using a kit lens. So what does all of this mean? First, this information is useful when comparing cameras that you might be thinking about buying. Now, the second reason this information is good is regardless of the camera you currently have, knowing more about your focus points will help you maximize the autofocus performance of your camera. With that in mind, here are some guidelines for choosing focus points for the best possible focus performance. First, when in doubt, use your center focus point. No matter what camera you have, the center focus point is generally the fastest, most sensitive, and most accurate focus point on the camera. And if nothing else is working for you, use the center focus point. Second, figure out how many cross-type focus points your camera has, and if they are not all cross-type, figure out which ones are the cross-type points. Then, when you need fast and accurate focus, limit your use to those cross-type points. Third, figure out the low light sensitivity and the aperture sensitivity ratings, and be aware of that when selecting lenses and or using teleconverters for optimal focus performance. Finally, when shooting in low light, have a flashlight handy, because if all else fails, shining a light on your subject can help your camera focus. Now, I've put all of this and more together in my free autofocus guide, which you can get at this link right here. It'll cover all of these different focus point types. It'll talk about the different focus modes, and it covers focus areas, which I haven't even talked about yet. And if you have any questions about focus points or photography in general, let me know down in the comments. And then do me a favor, would you like this video? Subscribe to my channel. If you really like this video, please share it with your friends. Sharing really helps me in the channel. But whether or not you share or like or subscribe or anything else, you better get out there and take some damn photos. I'll see you guys soon. For example, all Canon, oh my God. Thank you for watching. Now, I get loads of questions and they all boil down to one thing, which is how do I make my camera do what I want it to do? And here's the thing, your camera is like an instrument, and you can't make music if you can't play your instrument. If you want to learn how to play your camera like the instrument it is, visit this link right here to check out my Guide to Shooting in Manual Mode video course.